Welcome to the Forgotten Cell, where we unearth the secrets buried beneath time. Imagine your own home, the place where you whisper your secrets, where you feel truly alone. Now imagine that a hidden presence has been listening to every word, every argument, every betrayal for over a decade. What if you had the power to turn the tables? The hunter becomes the hunted. But who is the predator? And who has become the shadow in the walls? In the year 1837, the Fairwind Plantation was a scar of whitewashed stone on the red earth of South Carolina's backwoods. Beneath its groaning timbers and sprawling porches, a stillness more profound than stone itself held the house captive. Within that stillness moved Millie, a girl of 15 who had already lived more lives than a cat. Born into bondage, her existence was a quiet, constant labor. Her skin the color of pine bark, her hands small but hardened from years of polishing silver and laundering silks that would never belong to her. Millie was not a person to the Fairwinds. She was a presence, a thing that cleaned and folded and vanished again unseen. But they made one crucial mistake. They forgot that a presence could also be a witness. Millie's true gift was her silence. She learned early that people spoke their truest selves when they believed no one was listening. From the kitchen to the master's study, she was a quiet, moving ear, absorbing every crack in the veneer of their lives. She knew that Mrs. Evelyn Fairwind slept in a separate bed, a silent treaty of disdain. She knew the master's voice tightened like a noose each time he read a certain letter. And she knew that the young heir, Caleb, harbored a cruelty that no tutor could ever beat out of him. At night, when the Fairwinds believed they were safe behind closed doors, Millie would lie beneath the loose floorboards of the attic, where the sound of their voices slid through the cracks like cold, hard rain. The house itself was slowly sinking, its walls swelling with humidity, its pipes groaning with age. But Millie knew its rhythms like her own breath. Years earlier, she had discovered a narrow crawl space behind the pantry walls that opened into a hidden cavity beside the master's study. From there she could hear the murmur of his voice, the clink of glass on glass and the slow, quiet unraveling of his mind. No one had taught Millie to listen. It came as naturally as hunger. In silence, she had survived the sale of her mother when she was just 7. In silence, she had endured the bite of the overseer's belt. She had watched others break. The old man who sang too loud, the girl who tried to run, the boy who simply stared too long at the horizon. She had learned that sound invited pain, but silence. Silence gave her the one thing they could never take: knowledge. And knowledge, like time, was a currency she knew how to store. That spring, a new rumor passed through the slave quarters like smoke. A man named Jonah, a field hand from the cotton rows, had escaped. They said he slipped into the woods during the night watch, vanishing into the shadow of the moon. The dogs were sent after him. Shots were fired, but no body was ever found. The Fairwinds mentioned it only once at their dinner table, before falling into an uneasy quiet. But Millie knew better than to trust the silence of white folks. There was something wrong about that night. The dogs returned too quickly. The overseer's clothes were burned, and for days afterward, Evelyn paced the halls with a nervous, flicking glance toward the pantry, as if something lived behind the very walls. Millie said nothing, but a spark of suspicion had caught in her heart. Every night after her chores were done, she lay beneath the attic floorboards, listening not just to the Fairwinds, but to the house itself. She listened to the ancient creaks and groans, the breath of wind through the chinks, the scamper of rats and raccoons between timber and nail. It was then she began to sense a new presence, something slower, more deliberate than any animal. There was a faint shifting in the walls, a soft, deliberate scrape. She waited, listening, counting the seconds between each faint sound, until one night she heard it, a breath human and achingly close. And in that single, profound moment, every secret she had ever hoarded, every silent year of survival, solidified into a single, terrifying truth. Jonah hadn't fled the plantation. He had simply gone deeper into its dark heart. He was still here, hidden, and in the dead of the night, in the belly of the beast, she was no longer the only shadow in the walls. The breath came again on the 5th night, a ragged, shallow sound from behind the pantry wall, followed by a faint scraping. But Millie knew the sound of hunger, and it was not the wind. It was desperation trying not to be heard. She waited for the house to fall into its deep slumber, then crept from her attic corner, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. In the pantry, Behind barrels of flour and a rotting crate of apples, she found it. A thin seam where two planks didn't quite meet. She pressed her ear to the gap. A whisper came through, a dry rasp that was more plea than threat. "Don't scream." Jonah was there. He had not crossed a river or scaled a fence. He had folded himself into the very skeleton of the house. He was nothing but hollow eyes and cheeks carved by hunger, his skin slick with sweat and dust, a thing not quite alive, but he was. Millie didn't scream. She didn't speak. She simply nodded and melted back into the shadows. That night, she returned with a scrap of cornbread hidden in her apron and a tin cup of water. She passed them through the seam. He took them without a word, not from rudeness, but because words would have cost too much. For days she brought him more. Broken potatoes, bruised peaches, slivers of salt pork she'd stolen from beneath Evelyn Fairwind's own dinner plate. And Jonah remained between the walls. The cavity was no wider than a coffin, a sliver of space never meant for a man, yet he endured. Once a blacksmith, his hands had known fire and metal and force. Now they trembled as he lifted a crust of bread, but he watched and listened. Soon Millie began to visit longer, her whispers a lifeline. She told him what she heard in the halls, the mounting debts of the master, the secret letters Evelyn burned in the hearth, the boy Caleb's escalating violence. She became his ear to the outside world, and Jonah in return became something else, not just a fugitive but a witness. Time passed strangely. The seasons bled into each other. Storms left their claw marks on the roof. New slaves arrived, old ones vanished. Millie grew taller, quieter still. Her silence was no longer born of fear. It had become a form of power. There were close calls. Once, Evelyn paused in the pantry, a frown on her face as if hearing something. But she said nothing, and the moment passed. Another time, Caleb nearly discovered a missing piece of fruit, and Millie had to burn her own hand in the stove to draw his attention away. But Jonah remained hidden. Months turned into years. By the 5th year, the house had absorbed him. He moved through the crawl spaces like a breath between ribs. Millie had mapped every creak, every beam that could bear his weight. She had taught him how to exist inside the silence, to sleep during the day and move at night, to watch without being seen, to listen without breathing. 11 years passed, and no one knew but her. By the 6th year of Jonah's concealment, the Fairwind plantation had begun to rot from within. The white paint on its columns flaked like dry skin, the shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges, and mold crept like silent fingers across the parlor ceiling. But this decay of wood and plaster was nothing compared to the rot festering behind the faces of its masters. From the hollow spaces behind walls and under floorboards, Jonah absorbed every whispered panic, every drunken confession. What began as an act of survival had become something else, a kind of dark witnessing. Through Millie, now a woman, Jonah learned the full sickness of the family who claimed dominion over their lives. Evelyn had grown brittle and pale. She wrote letters by candlelight, always burning them the moment the ink dried. Millie once stole a fragment, a corner of parchment that hadn't caught fire, and Jonah pieced together a few words. Wilton will suspect nothing. Abolitionists in Charleston must be careful. It seemed Evelyn played a dangerous game, dancing on the edge of treason in a land that fed itself on the flesh of the enslaved. The master, Wilton Fairwind, was unraveling. He developed a deep paranoia, firing 2 overseers in the same month, accusing slaves of poisoning livestock and whispering in tongues. Jonah listened from behind the walls as Wilton wept alone in his study, not out of guilt, but of sheer terror. Then there was Caleb. The cruel child had matured into a cruel man, his punishments rituals of violence. He beat a boy half to death for dropping a plate, branded a woman for falling asleep. There was a pleasure in him that delighted in the silence of those who could not protest. Jonah knew that silence. It was not submission. It was the calm before the storm. Millie remained invisible, but her presence grew sharper. She had learned to move without a trace, to speak only with a calculated dullness. To Evelyn she was useful. To Caleb she was beneath notice. To Jonah she was the only thread connecting his exile to the world outside. They developed their own language, a touch of fingers through a wall plank to signal safety, a pebble placed beneath a loose board to warn of danger. They were ghosts living among the living. One night, Millie brought news that turned Jonah's stomach cold. A new law had passed. Slave catchers from the north were being paid to hunt fugitives, and the fair winds were considering selling off surplus hands to cover their mounting debts. Evelyn had made a list and Millie had seen it. Her name was third. That night, Jonah moved deeper into the walls than ever before, sliding past dead rats and cobwebs, inching along beams no wider than a handspan. He reached the dining room crawl space just in time to hear Caleb and Wilton speaking in hushed tones. They spoke of land loss, of creditors, of selling Evelyn's jewelry and of selling Millie. "She's quiet," Caleb said. "But there's something about her I don't trust." Jonah returned to the pantry, his body shaking with a slow-burning rage. He pressed his forehead to the wood and whispered Millie's name. When she arrived, he said only one word, "soon," and they both knew what it meant. The time for listening was over. The time for the storm had finally arrived. The master, Wilton Fairwind, was a ghost of his former self, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and the invisible weight of his debts. Caleb's cruelty had sharpened into a chilling obsession, and Evelyn's whispered conspiracies now felt like suffocating air. Millie, who had endured the house's tyranny for over a decade, felt a change in the current of the air, subtle but unmistakable. The notice of her impending sale arrived quietly, slipped under a door by an overseer, who mistook her silence for ignorance. The destination was a new hell, a plantation on the Mississippi River, to a man rumored to brand his slaves for the slightest error. The thought of it ignited a fire in Millie's belly, a heat forged in years of suffering and observation. She did not tremble. She listened. She planned. Jonah, still hidden behind the walls, had grown thinner but not weaker. The years had made him small and silent, a part of the house itself. He could move through its beams and crawl spaces without alerting a soul. Together, he and Millie had catalogued every weakness, every hidden supply, every secret passage that the fair winds ignored. They had lived like shadows, learning to turn patience into power and fear into knowledge. On the eve of her departure, Millie approached the pantry wall with deliberate steps. She touched the boards, pressing her hands against the worn grain, remembering each secret she had mapped over the years. Jonah listened to her soft, measured breathing. He knew without words what was coming. The reckoning had begun. It started with Caleb. He awoke in the night with a fever, his body convulsing, his voice a strangled howl that carried through the halls. The sickness spread. Wilton Fairwind, once so towering and unyielding, collapsed next, racked with a pain no doctor could explain. Evelyn followed soon after, clutching the letters she had burned, her body seized by a sickness that stole the breath from her lungs. The plantation was silent, but it was the silence of a tomb. The servants whispered, blaming the strange illness on the swamps or the water, never once suspecting the very walls they stood within. Millie moved quietly among the rooms, touching the surfaces she had known since childhood, feeling the pulse of the house as though it were her own. Jonah emerged only in whispers, guiding her through the spaces she alone could traverse safely. Together, they had become the unseen force that had upended the household. They had learned not just to survive, but to turn years of hidden knowledge into a weapon. By the seventh day, the fair winds were gone. Not by escape, not by law, but by something older, something patient. The house had reclaimed itself, its walls echoing with the final absence of those who had once ruled it. In that quiet, Millie and Jonah remained. They were no longer slaves. They were no longer fugitives. They were something else entirely. They were the keepers of the house, the heirs of its secrets and the custodians of a justice long denied. The wind stirred through the broken shutters, carrying the faintest whisper of triumph. Millie closed her eyes listening to it, and for the first time in her life allowed herself a moment of calm. Years of silence had borne fruit. The house breathed, and they had become its voice. The years that followed passed quietly. The plantation stood as a monument to its own defeat, its shutters hanging crooked, the white paint peeling in long, curling strips. The cotton fields had grown wild, a jungle of green and brown where once only white fiber grew. Nature had begun reclaiming what humans had tried to command. In that slow reclamation, Millie found a strange comfort. She remained in the house not as a slave, but as its guardian. Her body had changed over the years, leaner, stronger, tempered by a lifetime of secrecy and quiet observation. Jonah, once crushed by hunger and fear, had become a shadow, moving through the hidden passages with an unnatural grace. They were inseparable from the house, indistinguishable from its shadows, its creaks, its groans. Visitors were rare, but when they came, they spoke of a presence they could not name, of whispers behind walls and footsteps that did not belong to any living person. No one knew what had remained after the fair winds disappeared. Millie and Jonah, hidden and patient, had become part of the house's pulse, part of its memory. Every secret, every cruelty, every betrayal they had listened to and catalogued over the years was etched into the walls, into the floorboards, into the very air itself. They had survived, and in doing so had taken a measure of power from those who had once wielded it so carelessly. The house, once a site of terror and suffering, had become a place of quiet authority where the wrongs committed would not be forgotten. In the silence they listened. In the shadows they waited. And in the long nights when the wind passed through the broken panes, the house seemed to breathe. It remembered, and so did they.